Hey guys, the Firebird is here. It's just me. My brother couldn't be here today, as always, because he was trying to find his credit card so he could become a patron and get all the great perks that come with it. If you haven't already, make sure to donate to my Patreon. Anyways, jokes aside, today we are talking about Transformers Follow Cybertron, the game everyone loves and remembers fondly. Since there are rumors that a new Transformers game is coming out soon, maybe even this week if Laszlo Ben is to be believed. Well, he didn't say that it's guaranteed, he just said that it's a likely possibility. But today I wanted to take a look back at Transformers Follow Cybertron. Now, in the game, the story kinda ends in a cliffhanger with the Ark and the Nemesis leaving the planet, and then we never got our third game. Well, we got Wrath of the Dark Spark, but we don't talk about that trash. So, something that I bet a lot of you guys wonder is that what happened after Follow Cybertron? Did they all of a sudden Decepticons ended up on Earth, they ended up somewhere else in the universe? And while that's gonna be a video topic of its own, today I just wanna focus on what happened to the Autobots and Decepticons that got left behind on Cybertron after the space bridge closed. As we all know, characters like Ultra Magnus, Grimlock, Shockwave, and a bunch of others got left behind on the planet, and they were nowhere to be seen by the time of Transformers Prime Beast Hunters. In this video, I'm gonna tell you what happened to them, and more importantly, how was life on Cybertron after the fall. So let's get to it. Before we begin, I want to give a shout out to the fan art of the day. Yes, I haven't been doing this for a long time, but I really want to get back to it. I want to give a shout out to Ryuga Burema Disc. Oh my god, these names. Who made actually a fan art of my redesign for one of the Infernicons. And it looks pretty cool. And for those of you who are still wondering if a redesign is coming, yes, it's coming back. It's actually getting an upgrade. And I'm kind of planning to reboot it. It will make sense once the next episode drops. But for now, just know that I haven't forgotten about it. So thank you Ryuga for your drawing, that is much appreciated. And if you guys wanna, draw me some fan art that I can shout out in one of my videos, go to my Discord server and drop your stuff on fan art of the day. I might or might not show it here. Anyways, let's move on. Due to most of the Autobot forces having left the planet, the Decepticons pretty much ruled the planet uncontested, just basically going around the planet and taking out as many Autobot holdouts as they could. Shockwave, who was now in charge of the planet, attempted to arrest as many Autobot civilians or political figures that could pose a threat to his rule, such as Alpha Trion and a bunch of other Elite Guard Autobots, and this ties directly to Transformers Prime. Shockwave takes control over Iacon and uses the Autobot capital as his main base of operations, where he builds another tower much like he did in the Sea of Rust, to be able to conduct new experiments on the Cybertronian population, while the wreckers that got left behind on Cybertron mounted a desperate guerrilla campaign against Shockwave to try and undermine his regime as much as possible. While the Autobots and Decepticons were fighting across the planet to secure as many reserves of energon that they could find, the planet was very vulnerable. At one point, the Quintessons were able to launch a second invasion of Cybertron using Sharticon shock troopers. This army was led by General Tyrannicon, who stormed Iacon and took down the newly activated Omega Supreme and Devastator. He then sought to gain political power on Cybertron to easily control the masses and form an alliance with the Decepticon traitor Ratbat so he could gain access to the Hall of Records. The invasion was only stopped when Megatron, who was not on Cybertron, he was still on Aquatron, discovered the Sharticon matrix of leadership and used it to override Tyrannicon's command over his troops. The Wreckers managed to keep the Hall of Records in Cybertronian hands, while Rack and Ruin split off from the group and rigged one of Shockwave's towers to explode, basically crippling one of Shockwave's final laboratories on Cybertron. After the Sharticon invasion and resources becoming more depleted, Ultra Magnus gathered the remaining Autobot civilians that he could and sent out an order to all Autobots who had the means to get off the planet to do so. The Dinobots officially joined the Autobots again and fell under Ultra Magnus' command. They defended the remaining civilians leaving the planet against the Decepticon army sent to stop them. Not too long after the Autobot civilians left, Grimlock and his team will encounter a Predacon on Cybertron, one of Shockwave's experiments gone loose, and that one wouldn't be the first or last one they'll see. During the final days of the war, Many Autobots took it upon themselves to rescue as many Autobot prisoners as they could by making raids on several Decepticon prison camps after the Quintesson invasion and Shockwave's concurrent disappearance from the public eye. Basically, by this point, everyone was confused and leaderless, running around in small packs and groups just trying to make it. Grimlock and his Dinobots even participated in quite a few raids against the Decepticon prison camps, trying to rescue as many Autobot civilians as they could. But during these raids, they will also encounter a new type of enemy, the Forge. The Forge can best be described as Shockwave's fanatics. That's basically what they are. They're like this weird pseudo cult that worships Shockwave. They were very formidable opponents, even for the Dinobots themselves. The Forge were previous Autobot and Decepticon civilians that Shockwave had experimented on, turning them into his own personal private army. They basically went around Cybertron, capturing as many Autobots and Decepticons as they could and brainwashing them so they will also serve Shockwave. Being captured by them was seen as a fate worse than death by many Autobots and Decepticons. And then we have Shockwave himself. If living conditions after Follow Cybertron were bad, Shockwave just made everything worse, and you guys are gonna see why. After the Quintesson invasion, Shockwave basically upgraded himself into a new, larger and more bulky body. He also began using the Forge to build himself new laboratories underground Cybertron's surface in order to reach new energon deposits that he could use for his experiments. He fought against the Dinobots in quite a few occasions, but always managed to get them to slip and live to fight another day. Eventually, Ultra Magnus also left the planet to find Optimus Prime and other surviving Autobots, while the Dinobots decided to stay behind to keep an eye out on the planet and try to rescue as many other Autobots that were still under Decepticon captivity. However, not all of them were very receptive to being saved by what they considered to be freaks. The Dinobots were not very well liked by other Autobots due to their beast modes and the changes that Shockwave had done to them. They were essentially seen as freaks and for the most part ostracized by other Autobots. This point basically marks the end of the world for many Cybertronians. While many lived in small communities and still for the most part lived on cities, Swoop even took over Sentinel Prime's old palace and called it his home for a while. But energon started to run out and many Autobots and Decepticons were starting to starve to death. So many were forced to go underground, hunting whatever remaining bits of energon could be found near Cybertron's core. By this point, many Autobots and Decepticons had built small settlements in the deep underground of the planet. Daily life was harsh. It was not uncommon for Autobots and Decepticons to not bury their dead, since it would be a waste of energy and sometimes even leave them rotting in the outskirts of their city. Instead of finding energon crystals, Cybertronians will become hunters and hunt any kind of Cybertronian lifeform that could be found underneath the planet in order to extract as much energon that they had in their systems. If you remember in War for Cybertron, there were plenty of different Cybertronian species like the weird squids that hang around Cybertron's underground, or even the spiders. Those were the kind of animals that the Autobots hunted to extract as much energy as they could from the carcasses. Kinda dark if you think about it. Grimlock even became the leader of one of these settlements. A lot of these settlements try and have a kind of functioning government. For the most part, one Autobot or Decepticon would become the leader of his quote-unquote tribe and be responsible for dispensing justice amongst the citizens and calling the shots for everyone else. A very stressful job that Grimlock honestly didn't like. As if that was bad enough, the Insecticon hive, who hasn't been seen since the fall of Cybertron, were recently found underground. Turns out that as soon as Cybertron basically fell into ruin, they were one of the first groups to go underground, and they had a whole hive of insects just waiting there for Autobots and Decepticons. The Insecticons were a constant menace to the surviving Autobots and Decepticons. The Decepticons didn't want them, since they were seen as abominations created by Shockwave, and since Shockwave abandoned the Decepticon civilians, many of them formed their own independent societies away from him and his Forge. The Insecticons were even free by this point. They didn't follow Shockwave's commands. Shockwave had moved on to making Predacons and basically forgot all about the Insecticons. From time to time, other Autobot settlements will ask Grimlock and his Dinobots for help, although they will do this very reluctantly. They will ask them this when Forged soldiers, Insecticons, or any other type of threat will show up on their doorsteps. Most of them did this as a last resort. Probably one of the darkest and most interesting things that happened during this time period is that some Autobots Autobots and Decepticons alike actually began resorting to cannibalism in order to survive. Now, the Insecticons did this, and this was normal for them. If they killed you, they would just devour your entire body. They didn't really require just the energon to survive. But in a settlement like New Kalos, where the Dinobots were asked for their assistance, they inspected some bodies and learned that some of these Autobots had been drained off their energon entirely, like some kind of Cybertronian vampire. They immediately put the pieces that it was probably the Insecticons, and they went to pay them a visit. In there, they encountered Decepticon Kickback and his small brood of Insecticons. Snarl and Sludge were able to overpower them, and after learning that Kickback and the Insecticons were not the murderers they were looking for, they killed them anyways, to make sure that they don't do this ever again to any of their fellow Autobots. Eventually, Snarl and Sludge actually figure out that Airwave, the leader of the New Kalos settlement, had actually been draining the crystallized energon of the deceased civilians of the settlement. Once he ran out of energon from their bodies, he decided to move on to live prey, and started abducting some of the Autobot civilians. After Sludge and Snarl figured this out, they engaged into a brutal fight with Airwave, resulting in Airwave's death. When not hiding amongst their settlements, many Autobots went on patrol to protect their borders of their territory. For the most part, the settlements lived autonomously from one another. They made contact with one another every now and then or traded resources, but for the most part each settlement kept to themselves. Even Autobots from other settlements viewed each other with distrust for the most part. With the surging cases of cannibals going around and killing others for their energon, distrust amongst the Autobot communities grew. And if that wasn't bad enough, Shockwave was back to his old tricks. At one point, Grimlock and Soup found one of his old labs on the Cybertron underground, where they actually found modified dinosaurs, organic dinosaurs. These ones could survive on the surface of Cybertron. The Dinobots fought them, but these dinosaurs were an unfinished project and they died not too long after. The Insecticons, the Dinobots, and even the Forge were the first step into creating Shockwave's greatest creation, the Predacons. The Predacons were seen a lot throughout the final days of the Resource Wars. They will go around killing indiscriminately, and even the Dinobots struggled to take one down. But overall, life was harsh. Every day was a constant struggle. Autobots and Decepticons will still fight, mostly for resources, resulting in further casualties. If you were to lose a hand, it couldn't just be repaired because there wasn't enough energon for that, so there was a lot of crippled Autobots and Decepticons by this time. Meaning that both sides had to be very careful when and how they engage. One injury could be the difference between life and death. Even the Dinobots became weaker by this point, since their energon reserves were also very depleted. But still, life continued, and many Autobots started to wish that Optimus Prime will return. Now this part of the timeline coincides with the final events of Transformers Prime, the episode Deadlock and the Transformers Prime movie Predacons Rising. By this point, Autobots, Decepticons, Predacons, and the Forge were all in a state of constant warfare on the underground, though they all tried to minimize their contact with one another as much as possible. Until one day, there was a huge earthquake on the Cybertron underground. When the Autobots revitalized Cybertron, energon started flowing from the core once again, and the entire Cybertron underground was being reshaped by the massive event. During the initial earthquake, some Cybertronians unfortunately got squashed to death by the collapsing of several cave systems, but for those who survived, they were immediately repaired from any injuries that they once had. Their energon reserves were back to being full, and very quickly both sides found out that energon was starting to float again from the core. It was a miracle, and many Autobots and Decepticons rejoiced. Not that energon's flowing from the core once again, the Cybertron underground was beginning to overflow with energon. And then it became a race against time for the Forge, Decepticons, Autobots, and whatever Predacons were there to go back to the safety of the surface. Some Autobots and Decepticons who were so tired from fighting one another and just wanted the conflict to end, took it upon themselves to actually help each other and try to make it to the surface together, many of which unfortunately didn't make it. Some settlements were very reluctant to leave their settlements that they had worked on for the past millennia. Many of them were overwhelmed by seeing so much energon after having gone so long without it. That many of them were caught up in the moment and couldn't see the danger that them remaining there was. Some stayed behind and they were promptly drowned in the sea of energon or smashed to bits by the falling debris of the caverns. Some settlements actually had to be burned down by Grimlock and the Dinobots in order to scare the civilians into leaving, since a lot of them didn't want to. Eventually, Grimlock and the Dinobots managed to get as many civilians as they could out of the floating settlements and made their way to the surface, where they were attacked by several Cybertron life forms as well as a few Predacons. Eventually, the Autobots, Decepticons, the Forge, and the Predacons managed to make it all the way to the surface of the planet, where energon was floating normally once again. Grimlock and the other Dinobots gathered as many of the Autobot settlements as they could and received a transmission from RC, who commanded all Autobots to return to Kaon City, declaring that the war was over and the Autobots had won. The Dinobots were skeptical about this, but they decided to go and check it out, since by this point there was very little else they could do, and they needed answers. Unfortunately, they were not the only ones who received the transmission, and a group of Forge actually intercepted them as they were making their way to Kaon. The combat even attracted the attention of another Predacon, and the Dinobots rushed to protect the Autobot civilians. After some fierce fighting, they managed to fight off the Predacon and the Forge for the moment. Shortly thereafter, Sludge, who had been separated from the Dinobots, arrived with a few friends: Bumblebee, Bulkhead, and RC. Now this moment is awesome. I just love that the Dinobots found Team Prime. And if you're wondering when does this happen in the timeline, well, just as everyone on the Cybertron Underground was making their way to the surface once again, the events of Predacons Rising was happening. This right here happens a few hours after Optimus Prime sacrifices himself. Eventually, Team Prime helps the Dinobots and the Autobots fight against the Forge. The Forge apparently have one final stand against the Autobots and all get killed off by them. It's unknown if there are any more Forge out there, but as far as we know, this was all that remained of the Forge. Team Prime then helped the Dinobots hunt down the remaining Predacon that had been attacking their group of civilians as they were making their way to Kaon. Grimlock and Bumblebee managed to lock it down in one of Shockwave's old bunkers, where it was knocked down and trapped. Eventually, the Autobots reunited in Kaon City. A lot of the Autobot civilians started hugging and cheering each other, many of them glad that their nightmare of living on the ground was over. A lot of them reunited with some old friends that they thought they will never see again. Autobots from all over the planet started gathering on Kaon, where they were greeted by the rest of Team Prime. However, for Grimlock and the Dinobots, this almost seemed like the end of their world. When they were underground, they were still for the most part chastised by the other Autobots. They were at least accepted, they were at least needed, and they were also in charge of their safety. Now that everything's back to normal, they fear that they will no longer be needed or wanted. However, RC and Bulkhead convinced them that they were still needed and that they will welcome them here as Autobots, regardless of what Shockwave had done to them or what anyone else will think. So Grimlock and his Dinobots do decide to stay, and they help rebuild the city with the help of the civilians. As they began making plans for the reformatting of the city, Grimlock decided to rename Kaon to New Spark. Eventually, the Autobots not only rebuilt Kaon, but they managed to rebuild all of Cybertron. And yeah guys, that's how life after Fall of Cybertron was. Pretty miserable for most of them, but luckily things got better. Unless you're an Insecticon, a Forge, a Predacon, or a Decepticon war criminal. I always found it kind of interesting to just think what happens when, you know, Optimus Prime and Megatron just leave Cybertron, and what do the remaining Autobots and Decepticons do on the planet. It's a shame we never got a third game, like following up the adventures of the Dinobots or the post-follow Cybertron state of the universe. But I'm glad that at least we got the comics that do follow up on the story as much as possible. And seeing Team Prime be reunited with the Dinobots, that's such a cool moment. I can't stress it enough. First time I read this, my heart just exploded. That was great. And also the Dinobots don't die, so I'm happy for that. Anyways, if this video interests you, let me know if you guys would like me to do a similar video covering what happened to the many Autobots and Decepticons that left the planet after the events of War for Cybertron and Fall of Cybertron. I think that's another interesting video, and if you guys enjoy this video, then you guys are gonna enjoy that one more because there's a whole lot more to talk about there. But hey, question of the day is, would you guys have liked to see the Fall of Cybertron sequel take place on Cybertron, in space, or both? Personally, I would have liked it if a sequel to follow Cybertron had just happened in space. Like, I feel like there's a lot of potential that you could do from a story of the Autobots and Decepticons going from planet to planet, meeting new allies, encountering resistance, making their own settlements, and then just, the remaining Autobot and Decepticons being stranded on Cybertron. Although that would mean no Dinobots, I still think there's a whole lot of potential there for something great. Let me know all about it in the comments down below. I wanna hear your opinion, and hopefully you enjoyed this video and brought you some type of closure for those who, didn't know what happened after Follow Cybertron, because I know there's a lot of you guys who never read the comics or the novels. So hopefully this cleared it all up and brought everything full circle. If you guys want more non-movie content, let me know, like, comment, and subscribe. It lets me know that you guys are okay with me doing more non-movie content, like Transformers Prime, animated, Beast Wars, and so on. So yeah, I will see you guys in the next video, whatever that is. Bye guys. Anyways guys, before we go, shout out to our amazing patrons: True Blue 712, Stitch Productions, Stephanie Ballard, Christopher Prime, Predator King Hunter Plays, Mario Gordon, Allspark Studios, Scrub Lordo, and to our even bigger Big Boss patron Jordan the Great, who donated $100. And to our other even bigger boss Patreon, X23, who donated a amount of money. I'll leave you guys to wonder how much he did. Anyways, thank you guys for your donation, it's much appreciated. I need the money to be able to feed Squeaker, because Squeaker is a useless platypus who doesn't do much all day. So it falls to me and you. I tip my fedora in gratitude and toast in your honor. If you guys want to donate to my Patreon, links in the description down below. Some of these guys also do some YouTube content, so if you guys want to check them out, that will be much appreciated. Some of them do Transformer stuff, some of them do non-TF content if you're into that. But be sure to check them out, because you're guaranteed to find at least something cool that's to your liking in one of their channels. I even collab with some of them, Scrubler. But keep in mind that donating is optional, because freedom is the right of all sentient beings. By donating to my Patreon, you get quite a few rewards. You get to see some of my videos early, some of my more longer animated projects. You'll get to see some early sketches and even suggest some things if you want them to. You get to collab with me in some of my videos if you so choose. You just have to let me know. And you can request videos and suggest some video ideas. So yeah, it's a pretty good deal, but just remember, we don't force anyone. So yeah, thanks a lot guys.